He's written numerous books that you can see listed there. So I'm sitting there going, wow, so what kind of fun fact did he not list? So I asked him. He says he's not a fun guy. But you look at what he's got and the wealth of knowledge that he has and the number of books he's written is astounding. He's going to give us a talk today on Washington's Crossing, so I hope you all enjoy that.
Well, thank you, Ed, and really wonderful to be here with the sons, the daughters, the children of the Revolution, and I realize that even those of us not eligible to be part of any of these organizations really is a child of the Revolution. And far be it for me to correct anything that Brother Battle shared with us earlier. But Daniel Webster did not go to Harvard. He went to Dartmouth. If there's a Dartmouth person here, I'm surprised they didn't stand up to tell us that.
She sat on it. But you gotta understand, he only gave you 4 minutes. That was like 8-minute speech.
It is, sir, a small school, and yet there are those that love it. So the year 1776 opened with great high expectations in the American colonies, which were not yet the United States. In fact, there was an American army occupying Montreal and another one besieging Quebec. There was a British army bottled up in Boston, and Henry Knox, as I am sure we all know, was dragging cannon across the Berkshires to lift the siege. And of course, in January of 1776, Thomas Paine wrote his pamphlet, Common Sense, which articulates not only the reasons for independence, but also that the Americans had it within their power to create the world over again. You get this great sense of optimism, this idea that we are doing something new, not only for ourselves, but for the entire world. So that's as the year opened. And then, as we know, in March, what was the date in March when the British evacuated Boston? March 17th, thank you. Another correct, we call that evacuation day here, Bill. It's, New York, the evacuation of New York happened in 1783. So this was the last time a hostile army occupied the city of Boston. So we have a revolution really turning into a war for independence in the year 1776. And of course for us as Americans, this is the year of beginning, the Anno Septis of 1776. And in July, Congress declares independence, but then you see the trajectory of the war changing. In fact, on the 9th of July, as Washington and his army are gathered at the Battery in New York, having the Declaration of Independence read, they could see the largest force the British had ever deployed across the ocean unloading on Staten Island. A huge British fleet in New York Harbor coming to kick them out, which is what happened. The battles are in and around New York, at Long Island, at White Plains, at Kips Bay, were really disasters for Washington and his army. There were 30,000 men with Washington's forces during these battles for New York. And then in October, November, December, they're chased across New Jersey with the British trumpeters playing hunting tunes, fox hunting tunes on their bugles, mocking Washington, this parvenu, this guy who imagined himself to be a gentleman. But now he is leading this beaten force across New Jersey, and by the time they reach the Delaware River, there are fewer than 3,000. His army was disappearing, and it's December. The winter is closing in. Most of these men's enlistments will be up on December 31st. And with an army so badly beaten it was almost impossible that another army could be recruited and enlisted for the next year, for the next campaign. Another event during this chase across New Jersey, Washington kept imploring Charles Lee, who was the second in command, to leave the highlands of the Hudson River, where his army was, and join the main army in New Jersey. Lee, unlike Washington, was a real officer. He had been an officer in the British Army. He had resigned and come to America, had a farm in Virginia, and in 1775, when Congress was creating the Continental Army, they put Washington in command, but made Lee the second in command, thinking we need to have an experienced officer. And Lee, for anyone who knew him, anyone who spoke to him, certainly was experienced. His experience was something Charles Lee never tired of telling people about. And Washington, as I think in the 8-minute version Bill would have told us, served without pay during the war. Congress took about 2 weeks to negotiate Lee's stipend, because Lee, after all, was giving up a pension in the British Army to serve the American cause. He thought it would be bad form for someone getting a pension from the British Army to be fighting against the British Army. So Congress did have to compensate him for his time in service. And now, in the winter of 1776, Lee is with his forces in the Hudson River Valley. Washington and his forces are being kicked across New Jersey. Washington implores Lee to come join the main American army, and Lee slowly does. Makes his way very deliberately from the Hudson River Valley into New Jersey, and on the night of December the 12th, he reached Basking Ridge in New Jersey, where he was staying at the Widow White's Tavern, spending the night actually writing letters. One of his letters to General Horatio Gates, another former British officer, was lamenting the way the war was ending, with the incompetence of the other officers with whom Lee and Gates had to serve, and these soldiers with whom they were burdened. And Lee wrote to Gates, "Entre nous, a certain great man is most damnably deficient." The certain great man being Washington, who now, it seemed, had lost the war. And had you talked to Lee, you would have learned that if Lee were in charge, and not just seconds to Washington, things would be turning out much differently. And then on the morning of December 13th, Lee was, by the way, the Widow White's Tavern was about 3 miles from where Lee's army was. I don't know if it's a standard thing for officers. Well, an officer wants to find more comfortable lodgings than being bivouacked with his troops in the woods of New Jersey. And he was sitting in his dressing gown, having a leisurely breakfast, talking about how Washington really seemed to have lost the war, which perhaps could have been won with more competent leadership, and other things to that effect. And one of his officers looking out the window observed that there's a large British patrol approaching the tavern. And Lee was apprehended in his dressing gown and taken prisoner by the British. In fact, by a British unit with which he had once served during his days in the British Army. And this, although to the British this seemed like the final straw, since they had captured the only competent officer in this army, to Washington this was actually something of good news, because I don't know if anyone here is a Lee partisan, but we'll leave that to another day. Meanwhile, Washington and his army makes it to the Delaware River, and Washington gets all of the boats on the eastern shore of the Delaware and takes them across to Pennsylvania. And then, as I said, is faced with this very real problem. The war is going to end on December 31st when all of these men go home. And for what reason will they come back the following year? Or will anyone come back the following year? The war does seem to have ended ignominiously here on the banks of the Delaware. And the British knew this. In fact, the British left small forces of German mercenaries in New Jersey in a string of camps across the state. In fact, in Trenton, there were about 1,400 men under Colonel Rahl who were there to occupy Trenton and make sure that the rebels didn't erupt from across the river and basically keep peace. And and by the time spring came, the American army would have disappeared. And in fact, Lord Cornwallis, the British officer who had been overseeing this expedition to chase Washington across New Jersey, was on a ship ready to sail back to England, because for Cornwallis, the war was over. There was no reason for British officers like Cornwallis to be here fighting against an enemy that had evaporated after the battles around New York. So this is really the problem for Washington. What will happen when December 31st rolls around and these men go home? He is still committed to this cause, as are others, but doesn't seem like it can be won. And this is really the context for what then happens in the final days of December of 1776. Actually, as Washington's army was about to be chased across New Jersey, one of the really dramatic episodes was the fall of Fort Lee. As you're probably aware, on the Hudson River, at the northern tip of Manhattan Island, on the what's are called Washington Heights, where you would, I guess, enter the George Washington Bridge, was Fort Washington. And across the river on the highlands, on the Palisades over the Hudson, was Fort Lee. Fort Washington, Fort was taken with the British and their German allies giving no quarter to the Americans who were surrendering there. And Washington was on the opposite shore watching the massacre of his soldiers at Fort Washington. And then Fort Lee had to be abandoned as well. And with the fall of Fort Lee, one of the few who came forward to join the American force was Thomas Paine, who had begun the year writing the wonderful words of common sense. And he is with Washington's army as it retreats across New Jersey, depleting. And 2 days before Christmas, Paine writes one of his essays, a little pamphlet, which then slips down to Philadelphia to have printed. And it is called, not Common Sense, it's not an appeal to the future, but The Crisis, which this moment certainly was. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price upon its goods, and it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated. Whether independence of the continent was declared too soon or delayed too long, I will not now enter into an argument. We did not make a proper use of last winter, neither could we while we were in a dependent state. However, the fault, if it were one, was all our own. We have none to blame but ourselves. But no great deal is lost yet. All that General Howe, has been doing for this month past is rather a ravage than a conquest, which the spirit of the Jerseys a year ago would have quickly repulsed, and which time and a little resolution will soon recover. 'Tis surprising to see how rapidly a panic will sometimes run through a country. All nations and ages have been subject to them. Britain has trembled like an ague at the report of a French fleet of flat-bottomed boats. And in the 14th century, the whole English army, after ravaging the kingdom of France, was driven back like men petrified with fear. And this brave exploit was performed by a few broken forces collected and headed by a woman, Joan of Arc. Would that heaven might inspire some Jersey maid to spirit up her countrymen and save her fair fellow sufferers from ravage and ravishment. Voltaire has remarked that King William never appeared to full advantage but in difficulties and inaction. The same remark may be made about General Washington, for the character fits him. There's a natural firmness in some minds which cannot be unlocked by trifles, but which, when unlocked, discovers a cabinet of fortitude. having then introduced Washington as similar to King William, or probably the British king of whom the Americans were fondest, he introduces a New Jersey character. I once felt all that kind of anger which a man ought to feel against the mean principles held by Tories, when a noted one who kept a tavern at Amboy while standing at his door with as pretty a child in his hand, about 8 or 9 years old as I ever saw, and after speaking his mind as freely as he thought was prudent, finished with this unfatherly expression, "Well, give me peace in my day." Not a man lives on the continent, but fully believes that a separation must sometime or other finally take place. And a generous parent should have said, "If there must be trouble, let it be in my day, that my child may have peace." And this single reflection, well applied, is sufficient to awaken every man to duty. Let it be told to the future world that in the depth of winter, when nothing but hope and virtue could survive, that the city and the country, alarmed at one common danger, came forth to meet and repulse it. Say not thousands are gone, turn out your tens of thousands. Throw not the burden of the day upon Providence, but show your faith by your works, that God may bless you. It matters not where you live or what rank of life you hold, the evil or the blessing will reach you all. The far and the near, the home counties and the back, the rich and the poor will suffer or rejoice alike. Paine's pamphlet is a reminder that the war isn't Washington's, it is yours. Each of us shares in this, and each of us will either prosper or fall by it. And this pamphlet does inspire, as words often do, but still it is Washington who's organizing the campaign that is going to change the nature of the war. On the night of December 26th, actually Christmas night, December 25th and 26th, Washington with 2,400 men is going to cross the Delaware. In fact, the scene you have on the pamphlet was painted in the 1840s by a German artist who was so intrigued with this story. He paints Washington standing with the people surrounding him in the boat on this venture across this icebound Delaware River. And this is, in many ways, it's such a familiar story in American lore and in American history that it seems like we know it and doesn't need to be retold. But it is, as Paine says, something that future ages will hear. The day before the attack at Trenton, Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia doctor and public figure, visited Washington in his headquarters and noticed that Washington was writing on small pieces of paper. These were messages to his officers. These were the code words for the operation, and every officer would have one. And one drops to the floor, and Rush picks it up. And what Washington was writing were 3 words: victory or death. And Washington knew those were the 2 options for this campaign. So on the night of Christmas night, December 25th, Washington and his 2,400 men, along with 18 guns, get into these boats, mainly Durham boats, big boats used for carrying iron ore on the riverways of Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And Washington is standing, as are most of his men, because the boats aren't made for sitting down. They're meant to paddle, use oars to propel across the river. Henry Knox, who also had brought the cannon to lift the siege of Boston earlier in the year, oversees this expedition. And in fact, Washington had planned for 3 forces to cross the Delaware at different points. It was a stormy night. A squall broke out, actually a snowstorm broke out. The river was choked with ice. In fact, the ice was so bad at one point that one of the forces couldn't make it across. The snow was so bad that another force couldn't make it across. The only one that did was the one Washington was commanding. And of course, these operations usually take longer than you anticipate when you're planning them. And Washington had expected that they would all be across by about midnight or 1. And it's about between 3 and 5 when all of his men are across the river. And then they begin the 8-mile march to Trenton. And Trenton was held, as I said, by 1,400 Hessians who had 6 light guns. And they, Colonel Roll, by the way, one myth that some of you may have heard was that the Hessians were drunk, which is not true. So I could just tell you other things you may know that aren't true, but that would be beside the point. And these were good soldiers. However, they had been harassed because over the previous weeks, the New Jersey militia had been attacking Trenton, attacking supply columns, attacking foraging parties, and the Hessians who were in Trenton, think about it, they don't speak the language. In fact, one message had arrived from an American that they think Washington might be planning something. However, the message was in English, and Colonel Rahl couldn't read English. So he didn't understand that the Americans may be attacking. And then the previous night, actually on Christmas night itself, a Virginia officer had led a small expedition across the river because a Hessian had killed one of his men. So he brought a retaliatory party across, and they raided Trenton. They killed a Hessian soldier. And when Colonel Rahl gets news that Washington may be planning an attack, he thinks, well, that was probably it. He does, however, have scouting parties going out. He has forces around the perimeter of Trenton. And early on the morning of December the 26th, one of these Hessian officers is in his outpost on the outskirts of Trenton, and he sees a force coming along the road, which he imagines to be one of the scouting parties coming back. And then he starts counting, and he gets up to 60 men, and he realizes that's more than were in the scouting party. It's 3 times as many in the scouting party. And then he sees more men coming. And Washington has brought more than 2,000 men across the Delaware, and he's deployed them so that Washington is at the northern part of Trenton. Nathaniel Greene is going to go around to the eastern side of Trenton. Hugh Mercer is going to go to the west, and General John Sullivan will be on the south. So he's going to surround Trenton. And just as this German officer shouts that fiend, that is the enemy, Washington hears cannon fire from either side of Trenton to the south, that is from the east and the west. And he knows that this expedition that had taken so long to get across the river, these 2 other columns had reached their destination at the same time. It was very well planned. So he surrounded Trenton, and Rahl does try to muster the forces. Rahl is mortally wounded, along with about 20 other Hessians who are killed in this battle. About 100 are wounded. Washington doesn't lose anyone. He does have a number of men wounded, including Lieutenant James Monroe, who later serves as president, and also Captain William Washington, who was a relative of Washington's. I'm told, too, that James Madison was at the battle of trying to figure out what he was doing there. So it's extraordinary to have a battle in which one future president is wounded, another is there, and the third, Washington, is leading the campaign. The only time it's happened in our history. So Washington, having captured over 1,000 Germans who have surrendered, then has the problem of what to do with them, knowing that when the British in New York get news that they've taken Trenton, they will be coming back. So Washington now has the German prisoners taken across the Hudson, across the Delaware River, my apologies, and they then are sent south. We don't have prisoner of war camps. We don't have exchanges. So Washington gives these men a parole, go south to Virginia and Maryland. In fact, some of them stay. I have a few friends whose families arrived here through having been captured at Trenton. On the way to Maryland and Virginia, they march through Philadelphia, which gives the locals in Philadelphia something to cheer after a year of disaster. And then Washington gets the rest of his men across the river, and in the course of that, 2 of his soldiers, who now have been up since about 10 o'clock on the night of December 25th, and it's now midday on December the 27th, and these men haven't slept. 2 of them die of exposure, freezing to death, having fallen asleep by the side of the road. Having sent this message, having driven the Hessian, taken this Hessian outpost, Washington has changed the nature of the war. That has shown that this American army is never going to be beaten, that it will keep coming back. And that's going to be the recurring theme through the rest of the war. And in fact, at Yorktown in 1781, when Cornwallis, after the surrender ceremony, toasts Washington, he does say that history will record your victory on the Chesapeake, but it will look more fairly on your victory on the Delaware. That is why, and Cornwallis gets off of his boat in New York, having heard about Trenton, and comes across New Jersey now to bag the old fox, which he fails to do. Washington, for his part, realizes as Paine did, that what the Hessians had done in New Jersey was not a conquest, but a ravishment. They had stolen, well, think about it. You're a peasant from Germany, and you're sent here to serve because your prince is getting paid for your service. If you return home, you get paid. If you don't return home, he gets paid. The house always wins in this case. And they see the New Jersey as filled with rebels, which it actually wasn't. And they also see that the people in New Jersey have lots of nice stuff. So Washington finds Trenton not only filled with German soldiers, but also packed with grandfather clocks, furniture, other things that have been looted from homes in New Jersey. And he posts notices that anyone who's lost property can come to Trenton and collect it. His army is going to behave differently. It's not an army to loot, it's an army to protect and to return that which was rightfully with folks in New Jersey or other places. And it's that army to which your ancestors devoted themselves. It's that cause which Thomas Paine said was the cause of all mankind. And Washington, by making this attack across the Delaware, not only alarms the British, but he awakens the American consciousness that we have it, as Thomas Paine said, in our power to begin the world over again. And without this moment, it would not have happened. So thank you.